Hello, thanks so much for joining us for our study on Abigail. I hope you have read 1 Samuel 25, so you're already familiar with the story of how David is on the run from Saul, and he has no place in the court, no position in Saul's army, no wife because Saul had given his wife to another, no priest. Samuel had just died. No friends. His best friend Jonathan had to stay in the court. Nothing to do but run, and he's relying on the kindness of farmers to supply him with food and necessities for he and his men. But in 1 Samuel 25, he comes to Nabal because Nabal is very wealthy, and David and his men have been helping Nabal's shepherds out in the field, and he feels like Nabal would help him with some food and supplies. But Nabal turns him away, and if you're familiar with the story, David is very angry that Nabal had turned him away. But Abigail goes out and meets David with lots of food and advises David that it would not be wise to shed blood, innocent blood, because he would regret it. And so he thanks Abigail, and later on, Nabal's heart is smitten from God, and his heart dies within him, and 10 days later Nabal dies. So vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. And in the end, Abigail and David end up getting married. So that's the story in a quick nutshell. But if you've read that and you're familiar with that, that will help you the most. But let's get to know some of the characters in this story, and I'm going to ask the question at the end, how do people describe you? But let's go ahead and look at Nabal, Abigail, and David in this passage and see how they're described in this passage, but be thinking about how you are described or how people would describe you as well. Well, in verse 2 of 1 Samuel 25, we see that Nabal is very wealthy. He has 3,000 sheep, 1,000 goats, and he's known for being very wealthy. He's also known for being very churlish. Verse 3 says, churlish and evil in his doings. Now, churlish, that's probably a word we don't use very often, but it just means rude and mean-spirited. Very rude in a very mean way. So he does not have good manners. He's known for being rude and hateful. Also in verse 14, he rails on David's men when they ask for food, and that's his personal Nabal's servant's description of it. So railing, very negative. And he's also described in verse 17 as the son of Belial, so much that a man cannot even speak to him. So he's so out of control, people can't even reason or speak to him without him just getting angry and going off. Verse 21, David says that Nabal hath requited me evil for good, so he's repaying good with evil. And Nabal in the Hebrew actually means fool, and so it also says in verse 25, for as his name is, which means fool, so is he. So it's saying he's just a very foolish man. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. Verse 36, Nabal held a feast in his house like that of a king, and he's described as being very drunken. I think it's very safe to say that he is known for being a very foolish man. The Bible actually has a lot to say about fools and foolishness, if we would like to look at some of those verses, because we do not want it to be our testimony that we are a foolish person. Psalm 14:1 says, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. So, do you believe that there is a God? Not only that, but do you live like you believe there is a God? But even taking it farther, the Bible actually says that even the devils believe there is a God. So just believing there is a God isn't even enough. We need to believe and trust in God for our salvation. But fools live in such a way that just manifests that they do not believe that there's a God and that they don't have to answer to any higher power. So that's one characteristic of a fool. Another characteristic of a fool deals with their tongue and their words. Psalm 10:14 says, wise men lay up knowledge, but the mouth of the foolish is near destruction. Psalm 18:7, a fool's mouth is his destruction, and his lips are the snare of his soul. Proverbs 29:11, a fool uttereth all his mind, but a wise man keepeth it in till afterwards. So there's so much in the Bible to say about a fool and his mouth. They speak everything they think. They don't think it through. They don't use tact. And fools are often characterized by their hasty words. They don't think about it, and they don't hold anything back. So that is another description of a fool in the Bible. Another description deals with drinking and alcohol. Proverbs 21, wine is a mocker and strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. And Nabal, he fell into this category as well because he threw big parties and he was described as being very drunken. And this is also a behavior that is not a part of a wise man's life, nor should it be that of a Christian's. Ecclesiastes 7:9, be not hasty in thy spirit to be angry, for anger resteth in the bosom of fools. Anger, hasty anger, is another characteristic of fools. So we shouldn't be known for always getting angry at the drop of a hat. That is another characteristic of a fool, and we do not want that to be associated with us. So through these verses, we can see that one, living in a way that doesn't acknowledge there is a God, that characterizes a fool. Uttering all our mind, a drunken alcoholic lifestyle, and hasty anger. Those four things are characteristics of fools, and Nabal definitely is described as a fool in this passage. So those are characteristics that we do not want to be associated with us. So I pray that I would not live like a fool. Number 2, Abigail. Let's look at 1 Samuel 25 and how Abigail is described here. Well, in verse 3 of 1 Samuel 25, it says, she was a woman of good understanding and of a beautiful countenance. So good understanding, that would equal wisdom. Beautiful countenance. As women, we all want to be beautiful, but she probably even had just a glowing inner joy that would just come out, and I feel like that makes women beautiful a lot of times. So she had wisdom and a beautiful physical appearance. Verses 14 through 17, the servants feel, in chapter 25 of 1 Samuel, the servants feel like they can come and talk to Abigail about Nabal's foolishness. They come and tell her, hey, Nabal turned away David's servants. He said, no, we will not help you. Who is David anyway? That I would help him. And they knew that evil was probably going to come to them because of this rash decision of Nabal, but they felt like they could go to Abigail and she would be on their side. Verses 17 through 18, she makes haste to prevent evil determined for her household. And she does this by bringing 200 loaves, 2 bottles of wine, 5 sheep ready dressed, 5 measures of corn, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 fig cakes to David and his men. So she, as soon as she hears that evil is determined for her household, she's on it and she wants to prevent that from happening. So she brings this to David, she meets David, she bows down and says, please, please forgive my Lord. And in verse 28 through 31 of 1 Samuel 25, she gives good advice to David. And she prevents him from having blood on his hands and for, killing one or more people that he would later regret. And she gives him good advice. She reminds him that vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Verse 36, when she goes back home from meeting with David, her husband is throwing a huge party and he's very drunken, and she just decides not to go and talk to him about the David situation right then. She just goes to bed and tells him about it in the morning. So she doesn't try to rile up a drunken man. She waits until the morning to tell him what she had done. And in verse 41, we learn that Nabal actually, when she does tell him what she had done, his heart, it says his heart died within him and he became as a stone. That's in verse 37 of chapter 25. And then 10 days later, he actually ends up dying. So the Lord took care of it and David didn't have to. But in verse 41, when David hears that this had happened, he sends some of his servants and he asks Abigail to become his wife. And one of the first things she wants to do is wash their feet and be a servant to David's servants. So So that speaks of her servant's heart as well. We can see that Abigail behaved with wisdom instead of foolishness. She gave the proper advice to David in verse 28, reminding him that vengeance is of the Lord. I will repay, saith the Lord. In Romans 12:19, that's what it says. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. And she's also just married to a very difficult man, but continues to have wisdom and good understanding. So I ask, how do we act when we're around difficult people? Do we usually stoop to their level and rail back at them? Or do we respond with a soft answer? Psalms 15:1 says, a soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. And I'm sure Abigail had several opportunities living with a churlish man that had rude manners to bite back at him. But we don't see any evidence of that happening in this passage. Her servants knew they could come to her and that she was a wise lady and that she would try to help them. She chooses to leave her husband alone even when he's drunk. So even though her husband was in the wrong, she didn't rail on him about his poor choices. She was tactful. She showed good understanding in her ways. So we could learn much from Abigail. When we're around difficult people, we do not have to start behaving like they are. And the third person that I would like to look at today is David. In verses 15 and 16, the servants report to Abigail, these are Nabal's servants, that David and his men were very good to us, and we were not hurt, neither missed we anything, and that they were a wall unto us both night and day, all the while we were with them keeping the sheep. So the servants report that David and his men were very honest and helpful. They didn't steal anything. So Nabal's servants are vouching for David's men. And just a little bit of David's backstory, if you don't know, King Saul has tried to kill David several times, and it's just simply by jealousy. Because in 1 Samuel 18:7-8, the women, they started singing this song about how Saul has killed his thousands, but David had killed his 10,000s. And it says from that point forward, Saul was very wroth. And that's when he tried to throw his javelin at David. And then he was chasing after David with, thousands of men looking for him to take his life. David had done nothing wrong, but has to flee for his life. And David even gets the chance to personally kill Saul in a cave, but he doesn't lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. So that's the kind of person David is. And, David could have easily become bitter at God because of his circumstances, but he continues to seek God for his refuge. Actually, several chapters in Psalms, a lot of them were written by David when he was on the run. They call the Lord his refuge. The Lord was David's safe place. And David continued to encourage himself in the Lord. Psalm 59:14-16, David sings praises unto God, even though he's being hunted like a dog. Psalm 52:7-9, he acknowledges that Saul is someone who did not make the Lord his strength, but that he, David, will trust in the Lord and praise the Lord forever. Psalm 57:1-3, the shadow of God's wings is David's refuge, and his soul trusteth in God, even when Saul is after him. So we can see that David is manifesting wisdom in his life. God is his refuge. He trusted in God, even when he was being treated unfairly on a very grand scale. Maybe we've been treated unfairly as well, but we don't have thousands of people chasing after us looking to kill us probably. But how do we respond when we're treated unfairly? Do we get mad at God? Do we blame God? Do we get grouchy around everyone and impossible to be around? Or do we still seek God and try to draw close to God as we can? But in 1 Samuel 25, David was preparing to take Nabal's life. He had gotten, I believe, 400 men and swords, and they were heading back to Nabal, and 200 of his men had stayed by the stuff, and 400 were going after Nabal with him. And he just was at a point where he was ready to take vengeance into his own hands in this moment of weakness. But then Abigail comes along and reminds him that the Lord will take care of it and that he shouldn't do something hasty. and he thanks her for his advice. It says in verse 33, and blessed be thy advice, and blessed be thou which hast kept me this day from coming to shed blood, and from avenging myself with mine own hand. So he blesses Abigail for this in verse 33 of 1 Samuel 25. And later in verse 39, it says, and when David heard that Nabal was dead, because God had taken care of it and smote Nabal's heart, so it died within him. He said, blessed be the Lord, who hath pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and hath kept his servant from evil. For the Lord hath returned the wickedness of Nabal upon his own head. So David is just so thankful that he didn't make the wrong choice, and he blesses the Lord for taking care of this situation. So David acknowledges God's hand in all of this. So I asked today, what kind of words describe you, or who are you most like in this passage? Are you more like Nabal and rash, foolish, churlish, hasty, easily angered? Or are you more like David and Abigail, of a good understanding, wise, full of grace, patient in tribulation? And I just pray, Lord, help me be more like David and Abigail and less like Nabal. And just remember, how we respond to mistreatment reveals the state of our relationship with God. And I just pray that we're more like Christ and we just show the beauty of holiness more and more each day. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time.